Hello everyone, my name is Pete Simpson. I'm the Restriction Process Coordinator here at ECHA, and welcome to today's webinar on our consultation on the proposed restriction on per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFASs, in firefighting foams. I'll be your host for today, and I'll also be facilitating the live Q&A a bit later on, but I'll be joined with some colleagues, my colleague Bastian Zieger, my colleague Piotr Sosnowski, and my colleague Greta Franke. They'll be giving various presentations throughout the session today, and we'll also be joining you for the live Q&A later on. So what can you expect from our webinar today? You should be learning about the REACH restriction process. You should learn about the details of our proposed restriction on PFASs in firefighting foams. You should be learning about the consultation that we have on the proposal and how you can submit information to it. And you should have also hopefully been able to decide if and what information you would like to share with us in the consultation. And also you will be able to ask us questions and hopefully get answers to these questions. The programme for today starts at 11 o'clock Helsinki time, and I'll give you a brief introduction to the information session and to the REACH restriction process. Then my colleague Piotr will take over, and he will give you details of the proposed restriction of PFASs in firefighting foams. Then my colleague Bastian will take over, and he will tell you how to participate in the consultation, including going into some details about some specific information requests that we've made in the consultation, and also how to navigate the ECHA website and how actually to upload your comments to the consultation. I'll then briefly sum up, and then we will move to the live Q&A session. And there may be a momentary pause between this part of the programme and the live Q&A. So moving on to the live Q&A, this will be facilitated via a platform called Slido. In order to send questions for us to consider in the live Q&A, you need to join this Slido event, either with this QR code or by going to the Slido website and adding in the event code #PFASFoams. Then you'll be able to send us written questions, which we will then answer in the live Q&A afterwards. So if possible, please try and keep the questions focused on the scope of the webinar today, which is on the consultation on the proposal and how best to participate in it. Any questions that we receive that we aren't able to answer in the time that we have available today, we will answer in writing afterwards. And if you have questions after the webinar, then you're very welcome to submit them to us through the ECHA website contact forms, and you can see the link to that on the slide here. So in terms of what will be available after the meeting, well, we'll publish all of the materials. In fact, the presentations for today are already available online, and you may have already looked at them, but you can look at them again at your leisure after the event. The recording of the Q&A will be available, and there will also be a written response to any questions that we receive after the event. This will be available perhaps 1 or 2 weeks after the event, so please check back regularly. Okay, so that concludes the practical details of what we want to do today. I'll now move on to talking to you about the REACH restriction process in general. So now I'll move on to an introduction to the REACH restriction process, just because it will help you, we hope, to understand how your comments to the consultation will be most useful. So first and foremost, what's a REACH restriction? Well, it's a regulatory measure that should protect our health and the environment from chemical risks. It's put in place to address a risk from a substance that's not adequately controlled, where action is required at an EU-wide level. And it's important to consider that it's a safety net for other REACH and EU processes. So where, for example, the registration requirements under REACH or where the evaluation requirements under REACH aren't quite working to address a risk, then a restriction can be used to deal with the issue. A restriction will usually limit or ban either the manufacture, placing on the market, or the use of a substance. It can be a substance as such, it can be a substance in a mixture, but it can also be a substance in an article. In addition to sort of banning any of these activities, it could also set out, or rather than banning, it could require specific conditions for the use of the substance, such as the use of specific risk management measures when that substance is used to address the risk. Or it might require something like a labelling requirement where information for users is considered to be sufficient to address the identified risk. So it's a very flexible tool to address risks that are identified. It can be a ban, but it doesn't have to be a ban. Before a restriction can be put into place under REACH, there needs to be an assessment, which we call an Annex 15 report, and this is prepared in a dossier by either a member state, or the dossier can be prepared by ECHA when it's requested to do so by the European Commission. So what is in a restriction proposal, this Annex 15 report? It needs to include information about the hazards and exposures and the risks which are identified for the use of a particular substance or a mixture as such, or in an article. It needs to include a justification that action to address these risks is necessary at an EU-wide level. And the restriction report also needs to contain available information on the alternatives for those substances. So if we're talking about PFASs in firefighting foams, the dossier needs to include information on fluorine-free firefighting foams. Alongside the risk assessment, the Annex 15 report needs to include an analysis that indicates that the restriction is the most appropriate risk management measure to identify, or to address the identified risk. In addition to this, the Annex 15 report can also include a socio-economic impact assessment of the implications of the restriction. What would be the cost to society? What would be the benefits to society, for example? And the overall objective of this Annex 15 report is to inform decision makers when they take their final decision about what the consequences of the regulation will be, either in terms of how effective will it be to address identified risks, but also what could be the externalities of any of this regulation in terms of costs and benefits to society. So the restriction process is separated into 3 parts. There's much more information on the restriction process available on the ECHA website, and you can see a link to this at the bottom of the slide here. The first phase, phase 1, is the preparatory phase, and then the final phase, phase 3, is the decision-making phase. The phase that we're in right now with the PFASs in firefighting foams proposal is what we call phase 2. And this is where there is a proposal, it's been submitted to ECHA, and there is now consultations on that proposal by stakeholders, and there's also what we call opinion development. And this is done by what we call an evaluation step. It's done by ECHA's scientific committees. They undertake an evaluation themselves, but they also take into account information that's submitted in the consultations. So this is very much the focus for today, phase 2. So a bit more about this evaluation stage. It happens after the proposal has been submitted. There are 2 ECHA scientific committees involved: the Committee for Risk Assessment, which we call the RAC, and the Committee for Socioeconomic Analysis, which we call SEAC. And they are charged with looking at 2 elements. The RAC is mainly looking at the effectiveness of the proposed restriction. They are mindful of the fact that a restriction must be targeted to the effects or exposures that are resulting in the risk, and it has to be capable of reducing these risks within a reasonable time period in proportion to the risk. SEAC also have a role in looking at this proportionality of the measure. And when SEAC are looking at proportionality, it's supported by the socioeconomic analysis, either one that's contained in the dossier itself, or it can be a socioeconomic analysis that's submitted by a stakeholder in the consultation. And they'll be looking at the net benefits to human health and the environment of the proposed restriction. And they'll also be looking at any net costs to society of the restriction. So, for example, could there be any changes in the effectiveness of firefighting foams? Could there be impacts on the manufacturers of those foams, or vice versa? Could there be positive impacts on the suppliers of alternative foams, for example? So that's what SAEC will be looking at. In terms of the timeline that we now have in the evaluation phase, the restriction dossiers is publicly available after submission. We would call this the pre-publication, and it's important that this version of the dossier is not used for the consultation. And then once the proposal is agreed to be in conformity with the requirements of REACH, and RAC and SAEC do that, and in fact they've come to that conclusion already for this proposal, then we start the consultation. And this consultation runs for 6 months, and in this case this will be up until the 23rd of September 2022. The version of the proposal published for the consultation on ECHA's consultation pages should be the documents that you refer to in this consultation. And then what will happen is that RAC and SAEC will make their evaluation, taking into account the comments received in the consultation, and this is documented in what we refer to as opinions. RAC and SAEC will develop separate opinions, and then we combine these into one document, and they're then sent to the Commission at the end of the process. So typically this is about 14 months long from start to finish. Once SAEC have developed their draft opinion, this is subject to a further 60-day consultation on the SAEC draft opinion only. Now, there are a number of documents involved and that are produced at the end of the process. There's the opinions of the committees, but there is also a document that's called the background document. This is a modified version of the original proposal, and it can be modified to take into account, for example, any points that are made in the evaluation or any comments that are submitted in the consultation. So the opinion and the background document, all of the comments received and all of the responses to the comments are then sent to the Commission at the end of the opinion development timeline for the decision-making stage. They're also published on the ECHA website. So after we send to the Commission, there's what we call the decision-making phase. This happens with the member states in a body called the REACH Committee. And then beyond this, there's some scrutiny by the EU Council and the European Parliament as well before any restriction is actually put into place. So my final slide now is just a bit more detailed. In fact, you can come back to this slide afterwards if you don't catch all the detail. But this is what we call the indicative evaluation schedule. The committees develop their opinions over a number of meetings. And what they will aim to do is they will discuss different aspects of their opinion at different meetings. The reason that this is relevant to you as stakeholders that are participating in the consultation is that it's possible for you to make multiple submissions to the consultation, and it's possible for you to tailor your submissions to try and align with what the committees will be discussing at a particular plenary meeting. So, for example, and I will just talk about the first plenary meetings, is that early on, RAC will be looking at the scope of the restriction, and then they'll also be looking in detail at the hazard assessment parts of the proposal. This is at month 2.5, so at the first plenary meetings. SAEC will be looking at scope again, but they'll also be looking at the costs of the proposal to society. So if stakeholders, you have information that's relevant to these aspects, you can submit them earlier in the consultation than perhaps comments that you would submit towards the end. And it means that the committees are aware of them and they can begin to take them into account throughout the opinion making phase. It's important to remember that you can make multiple consultation comments, and perhaps what's most useful for the committees is if you're able to make a contribution at the start of the consultation that will then set out what additional contributions you may make at different aspects of the consultation and what topics these will be on, and this will really help the committees to schedule their work and how to take your comments best into account. Okay, so that concludes my presentation on REACH. I'll now hand you over to my colleague Piotr Sosnowski, who will introduce in a bit more detail what the proposed restriction is all about today. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Piotr Sosnowski. I'm Scientific Officer in European Chemical Agency, and I'm going to present you today the proposal of the restriction on the PFAS in firefighting foams. The PFAS gain increasing attention in EU, are also widely, and this EU chemical strategy for sustainability already covers that topic. And use of PFAS in firefighting foams linked to the environmental and pollution, and this includes drinking water. We have already some restriction proposals restricted firefighting foams in EU, and then some other proposals are still under the preparation. Also, the outside of EU, some non-EU countries, as example, the United States, California, Washington, and some others, and Australia, they have their own regulation limiting the use of PFAS in firefighting foams, and there are also some targeting defense sector regulation. The function in firefighting foams of the PFAS is the surfactant. So those allow rapidly forms film over the surface of burning liquids, and this is particularly relevant for and effective for industrial fires with flammable liquids, which are called Class B fires. Around 8,000 tons of PFAS for firefighting foams are used in Europe every year. This is equivalent of around 500 tons of PFAS as such. And as you see on the graph on the right side of the screen, the main part is used by the petrochemical industry, almost 60%, and in the lower percentage by municipal fire brigades, marine applications, airports, and military services. In most of the sectors, the substituted fluorine-free foams are already under testing or training, but I will come back to this topic later in the slides. Going to the scope of the restriction proposal. The restriction we propose to restrict PFAS as defined by the OECD definition presented in 2021, and those are any substance that contains at least one fully fluorinated methyl or methylene carbon atom. And restriction proposal covers all substances containing PFAS and defined above as constituents, including as impurity, additives, and also in the mixtures. And this applies also to all the substances regardless of the status of the substance on the market. So this applies also to those not registered substance or substance which may be coming to the EU market in the future, or even theoretical substances. We approach this issue about in the grouping approach. So we considered PFAS as the group of the substance. Group boundaries are based on the OECD definition, and is based on the structural similarities. So they have the same structure of the same part of the structure in all the PFAS within the scope of this restriction. And this structural similarity association with the common hazard and risk amount substance covered, and the biggest issue and the main primarily related is to the very persistent property or perfluorinated part of the PFAS molecules. Of course, there is very large group of the substance, and there are other supporting concerns, but those are specific to certain substance or subgroup of the substance, and then they are not applicable to all PFAS. And grouping is also justified by the objective to avoid regrettable substitution. So we don't like to have the situation when the one substance from the group will be replaced by the other substance from the same group having the same main concern or supporting concerns. When we are talking about hazard assessment, all those properties like very high persistent, long range transport potential, mobility, accumulation in plants, bioaccumulation potential, endocrine activity, toxicity, and effects on human health, all of them raise certain concern and in different combination of those properties. Those concerns is high potential for ambiguous, increasing, and irreversible exposure to the environment and humans. There is problem with difficulty to decontaminate raw water for drinking water. There is low effectiveness of the end pipe risk management measures and difficulty to treat contaminated sites. There is high potential for human exposure via food and drinking water, and there is potential for interregressional effects and delay of effects due to the mobility of the substance. Potential for causing serious effects, although those will not be observed in standard tests, and we have to also consider here type of overlapping or cumulative effects due to the exposure to different substances from the group. Estimation of future exposure levels, safe concentration limits is highly uncertain, and there is also some global warming potential from exposure from release of those substances to the environment due to their release. Persistence of the PFAS in combination with supporting concern means conventional quantitative risk assessment not sufficient, reliable, or practicable. So there is no PNEC or DINEL. Therefore, we have to apply here a case-by-case approach according to the Annex 1 to the REACH regulation. Risk is considered as non-threshold, and the releases are used as proxy for the risk. We focus on the environmental emissions, so PPT, VPVB approach, and we base it on two model PFAS as surrogates. And emissions are estimated for each use and life cycle stage. And input parameters based on literature, industry information, and expert judgment. But as you can see here, in absence of information from industry or on treatment of the collected PFAS waste, we assume that the collected wastes are sent to the wastewater treatment plants in 100%. While calculating emission summary, we take the baseline that all PFAS and firefighting foams are released during the foam service life. There is no effective collection and safe disposal assumed, but we assume that it's possible that if foams expire before the use, there is safe disposal possible. And then you see on the right side, you see the distribution of the annual emission between the different sectors. And then you can see the 60% of the oil and petrochemical industry makes up to 200 tons emission of PFAS per year. Lower is for training and testing and marine applications and so on, so on. Altogether, with all sectors sum up to 470 tons per year of PFAS emission to the environment. Risk is not adequately controlled, and release should be minimized due to the accumulation over time to levels likely to cause effect for human and environment. And effectiveness of proposed restriction is based on the effectiveness of emission reduction of the PFAS. As the dossier submitter, we have done together with the industry and consultants analysis of alternatives. And alternatives are already adopted in many sectors and for training or testing mainly. Alternatives mostly tested in small-scale standard tests with limited number of flammable liquids. The performance testing against large fires or for certain flammable liquids advancing, but is not completed. Performance of application system and technique as relevant as foam itself. In that case, it also has to be considered during the transition period for substitution time. We have considered 5 restriction options. The first one is a restriction on placing on the market, use allowed until expiry date of stocks. The second option is restriction on placing on the market and use. There is again transitional periods for sector of use. And the third option is restriction on placing on the market, use, and export. We have also two other options. Number 4 is restriction of placing on the market and use with transitional period per sector of use with derogation mechanism for Seveso defense uses. And the last option, restriction of all uses, unless risk management measures in place are in place to minimize emissions. We do not foresee any derogations, and all options include mandatory best practice additional risk management measures during transitional period starting from the 6 months after entering to the force. The dossier submitter is in favor or in focus on the option 3, number 3, restriction on placing on the market, use, and export. But all the other options are under the discussion, and those are also requested. We also request your feedback on all the other options during the consultation. To allow proper preparation to use the alternatives, we analyze this together, and we find that based on the suitable alternatives and time required to implement transition for testing new installation and adaptation and firefighting methods adaptation, concerning capacity of release containment, and there is no compromise in fire safety, ECHA propose transitional periods for different sector of use. So for Seveso establishment and for export, we propose 10 years transitional period. For other industries, civilian aviation, defense, and ready-to-use application, 5 years. 3 years for marine applications, and 18 months for municipal fire services and training and testing. And the review period and practicalities are also part of the consultations on this proposal. There are additional conditions. So 6 months after the entry into the force, we propose that PFAS forms will be allowed only for Class B fires. The set up and implement PFAS firefighting forms management plan aiming at minimizing environmental emissions of PFAS as far as technically and practically possible. And the user also need to collect PFAS containing waste and form concentrates and need to dispose this in proper adequate treatment, which will minimize release PFAS to the environment as far as technically and practically possible. And possible that shall exclude municipal wastewater treatment, irrespective of any pre-treatment. Additionally to those, all containers of PFAS foam concentrates and PFAS waste should be properly labeled. We propose 1 ppm limit of concentration of PFAS in the installations, which is well below typical PFAS concentration in foam, concentrates, which are up to 2.5%. It's high enough to allow detection and quantification by analytical methods, although there is no EU analytical standard yet set for this testing method. But also this limit is not too low to avoid excessive cost in equipment cleaning, replacement, while having marginal impact on emission reduction. Following our assessment, you see now that starting from risk option 1, 11,800 tons emission of this substance can be reduced in 30 years, and it's going up to 13,200 tons for risk option 3. The other two options are a little bit lower, but more or less all options are in the same range of the reduction of the emission within the 30 years. And 30 years has been selected here because of the long life cycle period of the foams, which is quite often 15 or 20 years, so to cover all the process and some time after the end of the life risk. Proposed restriction gives partial solution to prevent increase of general PFAS exposures, and human health and environmental risk for fluorine-free foams are considered to be lower than when using PFAS-containing foams. And we expect impact of reduced releases to avoid the need for developing and implementing more appropriate drinking water purification techniques, or avoid need to change drinking water supplies in the future. While assessing economic impact, we consider cost of additional risk management measures, depreciation of existing stocks, cost of increase in incinerating PFAS foams, which is, in our opinion, the only available safe disposal option, cost of cleaning equipment to comply with the concentration threshold, cost of technical adaptation of equipment for use of alternative foams, incremental cost of using alternative foams, producer surplus loss related to the export ban, and saving of avoided cleanup of incident site. We consider also environmental health benefits of reduction of PFAS emissions, but they cannot be quantified, primarily due to the lack of the knowledge about the effects. We also considered avoided release use as proxy of environmental and human health impact. Possible avoided remediation costs and avoided drinking water purification costs are not concluded in the saving, but described quantitatively as a benefit of avoided releases. And we presented also, which you will see in the coming slide, the cost per unit or kilogram of emissions reduced as starting point for proportionality assessment. Estimated economic impacts for each option and industrial sector. You see that in the more or less the four options, risk option 1, 2, and 3, which are the placing on the market, use, and export, are quite similar, and the bigger part of the cost is cleaning of equipment and technical changes. Similar but lower cost is for risk option 4, and then it's completely different for the risk option 5. When you have the 13 billion euro needed for cost of full containment in the long perspective of the 30 years. So cost effectiveness, as you see, the first 4 options are quite similar, starting from 415 euros per kilogram avoided emission for risk option 4, having around 500 euros in option 1, 2, and 3, and option 5, quite high cost, 1,200 euros per kilogram of avoided emission. So, as the result of this restriction, we would like to avoid emission of PFAS of this 13,200 tons over the next 30 years. We would like to have progressive phase out of each type of sector of use, and while in the meantime, additional risk management measures during the transition are implemented by all users. We believe that it is appropriate measure to address the risk within the reasonable time frame, effective and proportionate, and also practical and monitorable. It's quite a big dossier, so I would like to, in the next 3 slides, show you a little bit what is the content of the different part of the dossier. We split it in 3 files. The first file is Annex 15 report, which is the original proposal of the restriction, and you can find it's 206 pages, and the proposed restriction text you will find on page 16. And is follow up by the hazard, exposure, emission, and risk description. When you have identity of the substance, hazard assessment, persistent, etc., risk characterization, and baseline described in more details that I was showing here in the presentation. Then we are going to the impact assessment, when you will find analysis of the risk management options, overview of the impacts, and proportionality of the risk, including comparison of different options. And then we described assumption, uncertainties, and sensitiveness in the another chapter and the conclusion. You may decide also to check the Annex 15 report, annex to the Annex 15 report. It's 496 pages, but I would like to point you to the certain part of the report. The environmental fate properties are described on page 69, starting from page 69, and then you see further information about the degradation, environmental distribution, bioaccumulation, enrichment in plants, removal from the environment, decontamination, and purification. And then you have this followed by the exposure assessment, you may like also to read. And then in the impact assessment, we have described the risk management options in details, alternatives, which may be very important for all the stakeholders, economic impacts, and proportionally on when we present the comparison of different options. And then the last part of the dossier are appendixes to the Annex 15 report, 267 pages, and then you have mainly information about what we have done and what we've been informed by the stakeholders, firefighting brigades, and showing how the how the forms are used, the detailed form transition timescales, etc., etc. So you see here also the reports prepared by our consultants. Thank you.
All right, a warm welcome from my end as well. I'm Bastian Zeiger, and I will talk you through how to participate in the consultation. First of all, it's good to keep in mind that whatever information you consider relevant, you should submit in the consultation. We do have some specific information requests, which I will be going through in detail in the next couple of slides. But any of the information that you consider relevant to help RAC and SEAC come to an opinion on the restriction proposal, or ECHA, who is the dossier submitter in this case, to actually further develop the proposal, is very much appreciated. It is important, however, that you support any of the claims that you make in your submission. In particular, if you are trying to argue for longer transitional periods, higher costs, anything of that sort of nature, then it's important that you submit supporting evidence. Only then can the RAC and SEAC really properly use that information. You can also claim information as confidential if you see the need for that. Now I'll be going through each of the specific questions that we do have. The first one is on the status of alternatives. And here we are really looking for new information about alternatives that you consider relevant to the restriction proposal. In particular, for the applications listed here, so on portable fire extinguishers for Class B fires, tanks and flammable liquids in the transportation sector, high temperature climate conditions within the EU, and the availability of sufficient quantities of alternatives for the replacement of stocks. The next specific question is about transitional periods. And here we really would like to know whether the proposed transitional periods are appropriate. If you think they are not, then please submit information about socioeconomic impacts. What would happen to them if the periods were longer or shorter? And you have to make sure to justify why the information provided is really representative for the particular sector or use that you submit them for. Now, The next question is about some of the definitions that were used in the restriction proposal. The scope of Seveso sites is used to identify the oil and petrochemical sector, and for which there is a 10-year transitional period proposed. And we would really like to know if this is an appropriate way of achieving this goal of identifying these the oil and petrochemical sector. If you do not think that this is the case, then we would also like to know how else we could do it. Question 4 is one on cost estimates. And here we'd really like to know whether the magnitude of cost estimates is appropriate. It's important that you justify your assumptions, that you indicate which of the cost categories your information is relevant for, which use and which sector they apply to. Again, important to justify why the input you provide is representative. Next question is again on cost estimates, this time slightly different. So the proposal requires an implementation of operational conditions or risk management measures to minimize emissions. Do you have any information to improve upon the existing cost estimates to meet this requirement? And here again, please just justify your assumptions, indicate which sector they apply for, the information you submit applies to, and why it is representative for the use or sector you indicate. The next question is about the cost of treatment. And here we would really like to know if you have any specific information on treatment costs that is effective at removing PFAS from drinking water. The next question is about fire extinguishers. And we would really like to know if you have any information regarding the number of handheld fire extinguishers that contain PFASs in the EU. Again, please provide justification for why that information is representative. Question 8 is around the treatment of firewater at this current moment. And we would just really like to know if there's any representative, robust data that challenges our assumption that firewater containing PFASs is sent to either on-site or urban wastewater treatment plants. Please indicate how that information relates to the information in Appendix 2 and 3. The next question, second last, is on incineration. And here again, we would like to know if you have any information on cost and available capacity of incinerating the retired foam stock on the one hand and PFAS containing firewater on the other. And this refers in particular to paragraph 4D and 5 of the restriction proposal. Question number 10, and the last one. We introduced a labeling clause into the restriction proposal that requires the labeling of firefighting foam concentrates that contain non-PFAS organofluorine substances. You can look at it in column 2 under paragraph 7 of the proposed restriction. This is meant to enable enforcement without requiring targeted analysis for each and every PFAS. Instead, a more general analytical method could be used. So is this requirement enforceable in your would this requirement facilitate enforcement? And if not, how could it be improved? All right. So to close this presentation, I will address a little bit what happens to the comments when you submit them in the consultation. The non-confidential ones will be published on the website, and this happens about once a month. All of them are very carefully considered by the dossier submitter, again, in this case, this is ECHA, and by the committees. If the content is significant, it will be addressed in the background document. So that's basically the Annex 15 report or the restriction proposal that was put forward by ECHA. And it will, they may also, the information may also be addressed in the opinion of the committees. At the end of the process, we publish the responses from the dossier submitter and the committees to all the non-confidential submissions. Now, to get to the PFAS PFAS and firefighting forms consultation page, you can either follow one of the provided links, or you can quite easily find it via ECHA's homepage. You have to go to the top of the page, to the consultation heading, and click Submit Restriction under Consideration under the category REACH. Then you'll be forwarded to this page with the content looking very much, then you will be forwarded to a page that looks very much like the one that you can see on the slide here. And you will find the PFAS in firefighting foams restriction proposal in line 4 at the moment anyways. And you click on details to go to this next page. Here you will simply find the Give Comments button that you have to press in order to start the process. Before filling it in, you have to please take the time to read through these 2 documents that are shown here in the red box. There is a consultation guidance which helps you on how to actually fill in and what to provide, what kind of information to provide, and an information note with some background information. You then have to make sure that you also click the box that you have actually read these 2 documents before you go on. Once you start filling in the information, you will see that it is quite easy to do. There are some additional explanations that will help you and guide you through step by step as you scroll down. In sections 1 and 2, you'll be asked to fill in some personal information and some information about your organization. Section 3, you can give input that you would like to, here you can provide the input that you would like us to receive. There'll be space for general comments about anything in the restriction proposal that you would like to address. And underneath, you'll find the specific questions that we just talked through. Finally, in sections 4 and 5, there's the opportunity to attach any document, either confidential or non-confidential. Now, before you fill in the information, please be aware that it's not possible to save online and come back to the content that you've already partially provided. That's why it's really important that you perhaps prepare your comments and any attachments beforehand. When you submit, you'll receive a submission number via email. And it's important that you use that number when you communicate with ECHA on this topic. It is not possible to retrieve your submission, so make sure that you either take a screenshot or make a printed copy of your submission if you would like to keep it for your records. Now, with all that in mind, you can press the submit button. Thank you very much. I hope this was useful, and on to the next speaker, who's Peter Simpson.
Thank you, Bastian, for that presentation about how to submit consultation comments and the specific information requests. I just have a couple of concluding remarks before we move to the live Q&A. Just to reiterate how you submit your questions to us, the Q&A is already open, but it will remain open during the live Q&A, so it's not too late to submit comments. Please go to the Slido website and use the hashtag PFAS foams in order to get to our event. Any questions that you send to us through the Slido will be answered. If not in the live Q&A, in the written Q&A that will be available shortly after the webinar. And if you have questions after the event, you can submit those to us via the normal ECHA contact forms, and the link is at the bottom of the slide. Just to reiterate that all of the material will be published, the recordings from today, the live Q&A will be available afterwards, and then again the written Q&A 1 to 2 weeks after the event. So thank you very much for following so far, and we look forward to answering your questions in the live Q&A. Thanks. So let's move on now to the Q&A part. Thank you very much for sending your questions to us in advance of today, either when you registered or during the presentations that were happening just now. It very much helps us to prepare for these sessions when that's done. So what we'll be doing today is we'll be replying to a mix of the questions that you sent in advance, that we've called like the pre-scripted questions, if you hear us referring to this, and then also questions that you've sent just now via the Slido platform while you've been looking at the presentations that we've made. I'd just like to remind us all of what the scope of today's webinar is about. The main focus is on the consultation on the proposal and to educate you how best to contribute to the proposal. We will of course try and clarify certain elements of the proposed restriction, because this will help in terms of how you're able to contribute to the consultation. So all of the questions that we received today and that are within the scope of the webinar, we will answer either verbally, but if we don't get a chance to get to them today, they'll be answered in the Q&A document that will be published after the event, and there'll also be written versions of any questions that we've answered verbally in the meeting in the session here today. So don't worry about writing down say what we say, or even coming back to look at the recordings afterwards. There'll be a written version of all of the questions available to you to refer to afterwards. Okay, so let's get started on the questions. What we're going to do is take about 5 of the questions that we received in advance, and then we'll move into the Slido questions. So actually the first question that we'll tackle has been a very popular question. It's been asked by many people, and it's been something actually that we've attempted to clarify in the documents that were made available to the consultation as opposed to the documents that were initially pre-published. And this is to do with the overlap of the proposed restriction with previous restrictions or proposed restrictions on PFASs in firefighting foams. So we know that the use of several, in many cases, groups of PFASs in firefighting foams have already been regulated. So, for example, PFOA and PFOA-related substances, the C9, C14 PFCAs. These are already regulated under ECHA or under the POPs regulation in firefighting foams. But there are also proposals for regulating other PFASs in firefighting foams at the moment. And a good example of that is the PFHXA proposal that was prepared by Germany and has recently been through its evaluation phase here at ECHA. And the question are these restrictions all going to be aligned with the current proposal? And it's a really great question, and it can be answered in several sections. I'm actually going to take this answer, by the way, rather than the panel, because it's a question that we prepared in advance. So to start off with, it's not the intention of this restriction proposal to interfere or indeed to relax any agreed phase-out timelines for already regulated PFASs like PFOA and PFOA-related substances, like PFOS, like the C9, C14 PFCAs. What we mean here is when they're already regulated is that there is actually an entry in Annex 17 of REACH, or there's an entry under the POPs regulation. So there's actually sort of a legal already regulation on these substances. So our baseline assumes, and the baseline when we prepared this restriction assumes, that these restrictions would stay in place as they already exist today. And this would include things like any concentration limits that would continue to apply. So, for example, if there's a concentration limit for PFOA or PFOA-related substances in firefighting foams, for example, this 25 parts per billion limit, then indeed this would stay in place and it wouldn't be affected at all by this proposed restriction here. But however, some of the proposed restrictions on PFASs aren't legislation right now, they're just proposals. And I've mentioned the example of this is the C6 PFASs in firefighting foams, the PFHXA and PFHXA related substances. The situation with these is different. And these proposals are not part of our legislative baseline. So we don't assume that there is a restriction of PFHXA and PFHXA related substances in place as part of our baseline. This then means that it's possible that the decision maker eventually, because they will have both of these proposals on their desks at around the same time, we don't know if they will take forward the provisions for C6 put forward by Germany in their proposal, or if they'll take forward the proposals by ECHA that are detailed as part of this restriction. Equally, the timelines put forward under both of these restrictions could be decided by the decision maker to go forward with either one of those. So we do appreciate that there's a bit of uncertainty around the precise timeline of a phase out of PFHXA in firefighting foams. However, what will become clear when the opinions on the PFHXA proposal are completely published, that there's interesting information in the scientific evaluation of that PFHXA proposal, and I'll just highlight a couple of aspects here because I think it will be useful for you when considering this and considering how to respond to the consultation. So RAC and SAEC have already evaluated the German proposal for PFHXA, which included provisions on firefighting foams. And whilst the RAC supported some elements of that proposed restriction, so for example, to restrict municipal uses of PFHXA containing foam, it didn't support all of the proposed elements of the restriction of PFHXA in firefighting foams, and specifically around the use of PFHXA at industrial sites, where RAC wasn't able to conclude that the proposed restriction was the most appropriate measure. Equally, when SAEC were looking at the proposed restriction of PFHXA, they couldn't conclude on the proportionality overall of that proposal, which means that in terms of how the Commission, who are the decision maker on all of these restrictions, take forward the PFHXA proposal, there's a lot of uncertainty. Now, as ECHA, as the dossier submitter for this restriction, we were aware of these uncertainties as they were being highlighted by the RAC and the SAEC, and we've tried to address these uncertainties in our proposal, which means that we hope that the committees will be able to reach a more positive evaluation of the proposal here, and ultimately the Commission will be able to look at the least uncertain restriction on the table and take that one forwards where necessary. So I hope that helps to clarify this particular cross-cutting top question that we've had, and indeed there'll be a written version of this as well that you can refer to afterwards. So thank you for bearing with me on that. I'll now move to the next question that we'll tackle in advance, and this one is for Greta, and the question is there a PFAS master list maintained by ECHA for all the PFAS substances within the scope of this restriction that a compliance engineer could refer to, potentially or preferably searching with a CAS number to find out whether or not a substance is a PFAS and would be within the scope of this proposed restriction? So Greta, thanks.
Yes, unfortunately, there's no master list available, and but there have been some indicative lists published by ECHA before for certain PFAS arrowheads, such as PFOA or PFHXA and related substances. Unfortunately, ECHA cannot always guarantee that these lists are complete, so it might be better to work with the OECD definition of PFAS when trying to identify a certain substance. So this definition is based on a particular chemical structure, and if in doubt, it might also be useful to consult an expert. We will include the links to the indicative list that we do have in our written response to this question. So we hope that this will help you. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Greta. Okay, moving on now to another question that's been popular, and this one is more for Piotr, I think. The question is, do you think that it's appropriate for the proposed restriction to be based on the whole PFAS group? So this is the group that's defined by the OECD definition of PFASs. And the question goes on to say these substances within this group have diverse intrinsic properties. So Piotr, how would you go about answering that question? Thanks. I wonder if you're muted. We can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Good afternoon. Thank you, Pete. Yeah, we strongly believe that there is reason for grouping and considering all the PFAS together here, and the main concern was the chemical properties of the substance and the fact that those substances are very persistent, and this is common for all the substance in that group. Of course, there are other supporting concerns which we also address in the proposal, but those are not common. And we believe that there's one main, the persistency of those substances based on the chemical structure is the good reason to group those substances, and is also one of the reasons is also to avoid regrettable replacement, so that somebody will use other substance from the same group as the alternatives. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Piotr. And I think just to emphasise that one of the main jobs of the RAC, the Risk Assessment Committee, will be to evaluate the rationale put forward for the hazard and risk assessment of this group in this proposal, and they'll be looking closely at the scientific rationale that's been put forward for creating this group, and also to decide that the group as a whole is posing a risk that's not adequately controlled, and the group as a whole would need to be subject to risk management. So they'll be certainly doing this work. If, as respondents to the consultation, you have information that you think would be relevant for RAC to consider when they're doing this evaluation of the group, then by all means, please submit this in the consultation, and both the dossier submitter, ECHA ourselves, and the RAC will take a look at this information when they're doing their evaluation. Okay. Now, if we move on to another question, it's also for you, Piotr, actually. And the question is, will there be a complete ban of PFASs in firefighting foam, or will there be a threshold value like in the current PFOA regulations?
Thank you. Yeah, we proposed the threshold value of 1 ppm in the installation. So there's not complete ban, and there is like the threshold value. And then there is, we believe that this threshold value is good balance between is well below the typical PFAS concentration in foam concentrates, and we believe that is good balance between it's high enough to allow detection and quantification by the testing methods, but is also not too low to avoid excessive cost of the equipment cleaning and replacement, while having marginal impact to the emission reduction. So we think that this is that is the proposal of the dossier submitter. But if you have any information regarding the impacts of the threshold, please submit that information during the consultation. That will be really appreciated by us and the RAC committee. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Piotr. A sort of a related question that we're moving on to now about analytical methods that Bastian, I think you'll take. It's in two parts at least, so I'll just ask the first part now, and then I'll ask the second part in a moment. And the question is, how are all PFASs supposed to be measured in firefighting foam? So presumably this is for enforcement purposes, but also for quality control by users of the foams.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Pete. So the intention here really is that generic analytical methods can be used, like, for example, total organic fluorine by combustion ion chromatography. I would like to point out that we have also included in the proposal a column 2, paragraph 7, which points out a labeling requirement for non-PFAS fluorinated substances that may be contained in firefighting foams. And this was included in particular to enable the use of these generic analytical methods rather than having to measure individual PFAS, many different individual PFAS in the foams. But again, if you have any more information on analytical methods that you think is relevant, then please submit that in the consultation. Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Bastian. And indeed, sort of a wide scope restriction like this with many substances included, analytical methods can indeed be a challenge, but I think we feel that these generic methods might well be appropriate in these instances here. And moving on from that, the second part of the question is, which analytical methods should be used to ensure compliance? Maybe you can help us with this.
Yes, sure. So there's no prescription for an analytical method here. So again, it's foreseen that generic methods are being used, and there's an attempt to enable that, as I said. Please note also that the ECHA committees, as well as ECHA's enforcement forum, they will look into analytical methods during the evaluation of the dossier. I'd also like to point out that it is unlikely that you will be able to achieve the concentration limit without cleaning of PFASs if they have been used in equipment before in foams. And I would also like to point out that the concentration limit that was applied or is being put forward in the proposal is really a balance between the cost of cleaning in particular and the risk reduction that we're wanting to achieve here, while keeping, of course, the effectiveness of the foams at an equivalent level. So guidance on decontamination of equipment is very likely to be needed from industry. So please take a look at Appendix 1 of the proposal in particular, and again, provide any information that you think is missing there or anywhere else surrounding analytical methods that you think is relevant. So thanks.
Okay, thank you, Bastian. Okay, so we're now going to move away from the questions that were submitted in advance of the event and move to the questions that were submitted today. We'll take about 5 or 6 of these before we move back to the pre-scripted questions. I noticed that we have only about 5 or 6 of those ones left, so I'm sure we'll spend the majority of today reacting to the questions that were sent today. Okay, so the first question looks as though this is one for you, Piotr. The question is, does the 1 ppm concentration limit cover both the threshold in the concentrate and the residual content in the last rinsing water sample, for example, after cleaning out a foam system? Is that something you can help with, Piotr?
Thank you. Yes, just a moment, I need to see the in front of me. Yes, thank you. Yeah. Yes, this 1 ppm level covers both the threshold residual content in the last in the system and also in the foams. So basically when we use the foam, the system should not contain more than 1 ppm of PFAS. That it's regardless how you do this. So if you need to clean the system, if you also the residual waters after the cleaning should be also treated properly, not to avoid the emission to the environment of the PFAS. So yes, this ppm level applies to all the uses, all the situations.
Thanks, Piotr. So, yeah, I think just to reiterate that this level was selected by the dossier submitter, taking into account some of these challenges around effective cleaning and specifically the costs of cleaning, and it was to avoid the fact that installations would have to dispose of some equipment because it wouldn't be possible to achieve a lower limit than this after cleaning. But of course, this is something that the committees will be looking at. So if there's any specific information that isn't considered in the dossier about ease or how difficult it is to clean equipment to achieve this level, and there would be large impacts, for example, to achieve this level in installations or equipment, then this is exactly the information that the committees will need in the consultation. So please submit that. Okay, thanks, Piotr. The next question that we have is one that I think that I will take, and the question is, how will this restriction proposal feed into the discussions on the universal PFAS restriction. And this is the proposal. It's a complementary proposal that's being prepared by 5 countries at the moment, and is planned to be submitted in January 2023. So in terms of the relationship between this proposal and the universal PFAS proposal, is that when we were asked by the Commission to prepare this dossier on firefighting foams, they also asked us to cooperate with the 5 member states preparing the universal PFAS restriction. So there's been some discussions during the dossier preparation in terms of approaches that they're taking and approaches that we would need to take in our proposal here. And what you'll see is that, in fact, there is a common substance scope with our proposed restriction on firefighting foams and also with the universal restriction. So we're both using the OECD definition of PFASs as the starting substance scope for our restrictions. And there is also a common approach to assessing the group of PFASs. So we answered a question on this before. So the hazard paradigm and the risk assessment paradigm around the PFASs group that we are adopting for this proposed restriction has been developed with the 5 member states preparing the universal PFAS restriction. And what that will mean is that when RAC are evaluating this proposal, any lessons learned from that evaluation will be able to feed back into the universal PFAS group as they are finalising their preparations for a submission in January 2023. Okay, hope that answers that question. Let me move on to the next. Piotr, again, I think you'll be busy. The question here is, when equipment that was previously used with PFAS foam is cleaned, the allowed concentration after cleaning is also 1 ppm. How does this proposal go together with other legislation? So, for example, limits for PFASs in the Drinking Water Directive, or, for example, any existing environmental quality standards for PFAS substances under the Water Framework Directive?
Thank you. Yes, the answer to the first question is yes. This is threshold limit. 1 ppm should be achieved after the cleaning. So when you will continue using the installation for firefighting foams, though in that installation you cannot have more than 1 ppm concentration of PFAS. So this is the level you should reach after the cleaning. How this goes together with other legislation, I don't know exactly what you mean here, because I cannot imagine that the same installation is used for drinking water, and therefore the safety in the drinking water is, I don't think it's here in the scope of this installation, in this proposal. But I know that Drinking Water Directive, they will have their own concentration limits in the water, and that is completely separate, and this is completely different use. So I think it's different way. Concerning the environmental quality standards, I'm not sure if that will be also, if that was also covered here, but it's we consider the emission to the environment, but I don't know if that was if this is linked to the other legislation. Thanks.
Thanks, Piotr. Yeah, I think this proposal applies without prejudice to the other legislation. So if there's limits, they would apply. If they're in drinking water, or if they're in receiving water, for example, then those limits under those legislations would apply, and it would be separate from what we're proposing here for the firefighting foams. Okay, thanks.
Sorry, could I just?
Oh yes, go ahead, Bastian. Yeah, thanks.
So, yes, just maybe to point out, this restriction is all about minimizing emissions into the environment of PFAS, whereas some of the other directives and environmental quality standards and so on that you've mentioned here, and many more do exist in Europe and the member states, of course. They are mostly about ensuring that concentrations in the environment remain low, and thereby also reducing the risk from these substances overall from all sorts of uses. But here we're really addressing emissions from a specific use. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Bastian. We have quite a few questions coming in the live compared to the pre-scripted. So let's just carry on with the live questions for a little bit longer before we move back to the ones that were submitted in advance. Okay, here's a question, actually. It's just jumped to the top of the list. It's for you, Bastian. How can it be ensured that the foam agents, which can still be placed on the market as refills with a transitional period of 5 years, are only used on fires of flammable liquids, these Class B fires?
Yes, thanks a lot. So, I mean, of course, it is important that the operators of the facilities or wherever the firefighting foams are being used are aware of which installations or ready-to-use applications actually contain PFAS-containing firefighting foams, and there needs to be procedures in place to ensure that they are only used for Class B fires. If you think that this will represent some issues during the actual implementation of the restriction, or for enforcement, for example, or for the operation of plants, then please submit that information in the consultation, because that's going to be really important if you think that there are some practical issues that need to be addressed, or at least taken into account. Thanks.
Thanks, Bastian. Yeah, it occurs to me actually, but when you answered this question, that one of the provisions of the proposed restriction is for sites that are continuing to use PFAS foams during the transitional period, that after 6 months they should implement what we call a PFAS firefighting foams management plan. And this should ensure that where these PFAS foams are used during the transitional periods, they are only used on these Class B fires. So there should be this internal review going ahead at sites to ensure that indeed they are only used on Class B fires. And the presence of this report is it should be reviewed annually, and it also should be available for any enforcement should it be required to be looked at. So indeed, if this element of the proposed restriction on this PFAS containing firefighting foams management plan, we'd be interested, I think, in comments from stakeholders about how easy or not it could be to implement such a plan on site. Okay, did anybody else have anything to add on that question before we move on to another one? Okay, they're jumping around all over the place at the moment as they're being upregulated. So I've see what this one. Oh, Greta, this is one for you. So the question is in PubChem, which is an online database. It says that 6 million PFASs meet the OECD definition, and then there's a link provided. Are these PFASs being considered by ECHA to be within the scope of the restriction? Maybe Greta, perhaps you could start, or maybe Piotr, you could start if that's something that you want to come in on.
Yeah, I think this might be a follow-up question to the question we have just answered before, that yes, of course, as we said, it is definitely the first starting point to work with the OECD definition, and then see if the substances in question that someone is dealing with fall under this definition. And maybe Piotr, I could ask you to give your view if all of them are in scope. I mean, yes, I think so.
Yeah, we have this is basically the definitions based on the chemical structure. So whatever fulfills that criteria is in the scope. I'm not sure if it's 6 million. We know about the 9,000 of substances in the OECD UNEP list, or we have also in ECHA system also like around 7,000 substances. So the numbers vary, but it's like basically you should check the chemical structure of the substance and check it with the OECD definition. And this will be also used by other PFAS restriction proposal in the future. So that will be at least consistent approach between different legal proposals. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Piotr. And I think the rationale again for including this group is that despite this diversity of structures that could exist within this PFASs class, there will be a common property of persistence that underlines all of these group members, and in combination with these various supporting concerns that have been put forward, this is indeed the justification for regulating on a group basis. And indeed, if there are such a large number of substances, it really does open the possibility of what we might call a regrettable substitution from one PFAS structure to another. in order that the very similar properties might be maintained with sort of minor tweaks to molecules that would prevent this sort of arrowhead approach based to regulation. So indeed, this is an important element of this proposal. The group based on the PFASs and the properties of that group as a whole will be evaluated. So looking forward to information that people have on that approach to be submitted. Okay, we have the next question here for Bastian, and it is: have emissions from the portable fire extinguishers used by SMEs and households also been estimated and included in the exposure assessment? Thanks, Bastian.
Yes, thanks, Pete. Well, the short answer is yes. So there was indeed an estimation of emissions from all ready-to-use applications. So that includes those at SMEs and also in households. But for SMEs and households, this was not sort of spelled out and calculated individually. So if you do have some information on these particular users, then please submit, because at the moment you may also have seen in the proposal that we assume only 1% of the use to take place in ready-to-use applications, and therefore even less in SMEs and households. So please, if you have anything that contradicts this, then please submit in the consultation.
Okay, thanks, Bastian. As that question was on this ready-to-use portable fire extinguishers, maybe this is a good time to move back to the questions we received in advance, because the next one on the list is to do with portable fire extinguishers. It was a question, it was quite a complicated question, so we split it into 3 parts, but maybe we could move on to this one now. So the first part of the question was that the transitional period for fire extinguishers proposed in paragraph 3D of the conditions of the restriction is 5 years. But then also for those extinguishers that contain PFASs above the concentration limit, would the requirement that these are only used on Class B fires after 6 months also be applicable?
So yes, the answer to this long question is fairly simple, and it is yes. So only Class B fires should only be used for Class B fires after the entry into force, 6 months after the entry into force. So yes, the answer is yes.
Okay, thanks, Bastian. And I think a follow-up question sort of within the same topic is recognising that as portable extinguishers can be used on different types of fires, and they can be readily moved from one location within a building or an installation to another one, potentially in the event of a fire. Would this mean in practice that PFAS-containing fire extinguishers could not be used after 6 months rather than 5 years, because it would be so difficult to guarantee that they were used on Class B fires? This is the question.
Yeah, I think this relates back to one of the questions earlier from the Slido again as well. So it is the proposal is very clear. It proposes that that PFAS containing foams should only be used in Class B fires after 6 months after entry into force. The operator basically needs to ensure that a plan is in place to make sure that during the transitional period this takes place. And then also I'd like to point out that you may not need to dispose of the handheld fire extinguishers. You may also be able to actually clean and refill them with alternatives, as long as you can ensure that you're below the threshold that we've mentioned a couple of times as well. And again, if you have any information regarding this matter or anything else that would help the committees or the enforcement forum to evaluate the proposal, then please submit.
Okay, thanks, Bastian. And then the final part of this question on the portable fire extinguishers, it's about the labelling provision that's put forward. The question is, will the fire extinguishers need labelling, or will these labels only be needed for the packaging of these extinguishers?
Right. Yes. So the labeling would have to be on the container itself. So it's important that whoever is about to use it is really fully aware of what they are using. So it has to be on the container rather than on the packaging when you place the container or the handheld fire extinguisher on the market. So during use, that's important that the information is there. If you again have any information, in particular here, maybe on the impacts, so costs, or if you have any issues surrounding practicability of this labeling requirement, please submit. And in general, on handheld fire extinguishers, there is a specific information request, number 7, in the consultation itself. So please take a look at that if you're familiar with these devices.
Thanks, Bastian. And yeah, maybe for people that didn't join for the pre-recorded section of the webinar and only joining us now, we mentioned, didn't we, that the consultation is made up of a generic response opportunity where stakeholders can respond on any aspect of the proposal, but there is also a series of what we call specific information requests, and these are aspects of the proposal that have either been identified by the dossier submitter or by the rapporteurs of the RAC and the SEC who are evaluating the proposal, and they've identified that as specific areas that they would like information on to help them evaluate the proposal and help to improve the proposal. So before you respond to the consultation, please make sure that you have a look at the specific information requests, and if you have information, please try and insert it into the correct part of the consultation. It will really help in terms of making sure that your consultation response is as effective as possible. Okay, moving on then to the next question that we have. Again, this one I think is for Piotr. It's a question about scope. And the question is the scope of the restriction just on firefighting foams, and how are these firefighting foams defined? What about fire-resistant materials? Would these be included in the scope of the restriction?
Thank you, Pete. Yes, the answer is yes. The scope of the restriction is on the firefighting foams, so it's limited to the foams, not fire-resistant materials and not gaseous fire suppression systems like halon systems. So we do not have definition of the firefighting foams in the system in the proposal. I'm not aware of any information, any request from the industry to provide such definition. But if you have a good proposal how to define this, please submit it to us via consultations, and we will consider this to how to include, or if include this in the updated proposal. So please submit your proposal if you have any good definition for firefighting foams and you think that should be defined, is not clear to the industry and to the end users. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Piotr. Okay, the next question we have, it's for Greta, and is there a list of PFAS and non-PFAS containing firefighting foams that people can refer to?
Yeah, so unfortunately, again, the answer is no. So in the restriction report, we do list alternatives that have been specifically assessed in terms of their technical and economical feasibility. For example, you could see, check Appendix 6 for such a list. Then there are some other schemes that aim to identify also fluorine-free foams. For example, there's the initiative called Green Screen in the US. But in general, it is important to say that all lists should be treated with care because, as we also learned recently, that some fluorine-free foams may still contain fluoropolymers, and so it is important to double check and be sure. If you know of any other alternatives that have not yet been included in the restriction report, then of course please submit any further information in the consultation as well.
Okay, thanks, Greta. And just to elaborate on what you were saying there, so fluoropolymers, of course, are PFAS PFASs according to the OECD definition, so they would be within the scope, and the scope is any ingredient within the foam. It's not just the surfactant, so any ingredient that would be PFASs would be restricted under this proposal. Okay.
Sorry, Pete, could I come in as well?
Yeah, sure, Bastian.
Because we haven't really been pointing out so much yet that it's really important when you submit any information that you really make sure that it is that you indicate why that information is applicable, that you justify also, for example, which specific use the information is relevant to, which sector. That's really important, so that we know where to put it and where to take it into account when making the evaluation. It's important for the dossier submitter. It's also important for the ECHA committees, just to bring that in.
Yeah, thanks, Bastian. I mean, there is guidance available on the ECHA website for people that want to respond to these consultations that goes into a bit of detail about what level of justification would be appropriate. But I think as a general rule, respondents need to remember that at least in ECHA scientific committees for risk, the RAC, and Scientific Committee for Socioeconomic Analysis, SAEAC, they're scientific committees, and they evaluate based on data. So it's very rarely that a consultation response that is unjustified, that doesn't have any supporting information, would have any effect on the consultation at all. It would really need this substantiation to be effective in the consultation. So nice point. Thank you for raising that. Okay, so we just have one final question in terms of those that were submitted in advance. It's for you, Piotr, and the question is, how will the importation of raw materials involved in the manufacturing process of foam concentrates for firefighting be limited? And what restriction deadlines will be handled in these cases? You're muted, Piotr.
Yeah, thank you. Basically, we are talking here about the restriction of use, placing on the market, and export in the firefighting foams. So the PFAS as such can be still imported for other uses, and this will be only for the limit applies to the firefighting foams, and then there will be that is the scope of this restriction. So until there is any other legislation or universal PFAS restrictions coming into the force, the industry can still produce and can import the PFAS as such. They cannot be used for the preparation of the mixture in firefighting foams. But also that is the scope.
Okay.
And then, I think that's it. And there is the deadlines you see. Of course depends on the type of use and the sector of use. We have different thresholds. We have different derogation timelines. So that's it will apply to different. Depends on the sector of use.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Piotr. Okay, so that was our final pre-prepared question. We'll now go back to the ones that we've had submitted today via Slido, and we'll stay with these until we get to the end of the session. We have about 20 minutes left to go through all of these questions, and just looking down the list very quickly, I don't think we'll be able to get through all of them today live. We will reply to all of them in writing, of course. But some of you may have seen this sort of upvoting functionality that we have in Slido, and some people have made use of that. If there is a particular question that you would really like answered, by all means use this upvoting functionality, and it means it will become to the top of my list here, and it will ensure perhaps that it gets answered today. Okay, so let's go back to the questions. The first one looks like it's for you, Greta. It's about alternatives. It says here, fluorine-free foams are mainly synthetic foams based on mixtures of surfactants and in many cases the use of polysaccharides. Do you think this, and I think this is polysaccharides, could be a possible alternative?
Yeah, so maybe what I can start with is that in the restriction report, we have, of course, lots of information on alternatives in Annex E2 2. And here we have mainly, we have categorized the assessed alternatives into 3 main categories, which are hydrocarbons, detergents, siloxanes, and protein foams. So we do already have a lot of information on some short-listed alternatives from these categories, where we describe both the technical feasibility, but also aspects of availability and economic feasibility. About the details of this question, I'm not sure if I can answer this from the spot, but I would either see if anyone else from the panel wants to jump in. Otherwise, we can definitely come back with the written answer and perhaps point out also some of the relevant assessments that we already have in the restriction report to hopefully better cover your answer, your question. Sorry.
Thanks, Greta. Yeah, and I think if we haven't looked at a particular type of alternative to PFAS foams in the dossier, then indeed it would be very interesting to have this information submitted in the consultation to allow SAEC particularly to take a look at the technical and economic feasibility of the whole range of alternatives to the PFAS containing foams. Okay,
if I make it,
yeah, go ahead.
I would just point that any type of alternative should be assessed also looking at the interesting properties. So we do not recommend that you replace PFAS with any other substance which are classified as dangerous for the environment or for human health. So please also consider this, to not replace PFAS with other substance which may be even worse from that perspective. Just recommendation, but of course it's always industry decision which type of alternatives are suitable for them, and if they are not restricted in any other way. Thank you.
Thanks, Piotr. Okay, so moving on, this one looks like it's for you, Bastian. It's the question, it says here that PFASs stick on surfaces as crystalline supramolecular assemblies. Sorry, the question moved just as I was reading it then, which are water and oil repellent. So testing wash water is not representative of what's still on the surfaces of suppression systems. Can you provide guidance on how to undertake these tests?
All right. Yeah, I guess this question is somehow about the fact that your container may still on the surface have PFAS present, which may then later leak sort of into the foam as the foam is stored in the system before it's being used. Of course, it's important for us to find out if there are any practical issues around this. We've already pointed out in an earlier question that you need to ensure that the foam in the end that is then comes out of the system to extinguish the fire, that does not contain more than 1 ppm of PFAS. So if you see that there are any practical issues with this, then please submit that information in the consultation so that it can be taken into account.
Okay. Thanks very much for that, Bastian. The next question that we have here is about the end of life or the safe disposal of PFAS foams, either when they expire or presumably perhaps even fire waters that are containing PFAS foams. And the question is the incineration of PFAS foams considered as safe disposal? Maybe Piotr, you could help us with this. Are you muted?
I'm sorry. Yes, indeed. The incineration is considered as the way for the safe disposal, but it has to be in the high temperature incineration. But there are also some other way for the safe disposal also mentioned in the report. But yes, short answer to this question: yes, it is considered as safe disposal.
Thanks, Piotr. But yeah, just to emphasize, it is at this high temperature, isn't it?
Yes,
so it's maybe not sort of lower temperature incineration. And in fact, this is a really interesting question about the treatment of fire waters that contain PFASs, for example, and the collection of those. and that there may be other techniques other than incineration that might be deployed effectively to treat firewaters, and we list some of them in the dossier. Maybe one of the panel can elaborate on what section those are in, because I know we discussed that yesterday, but we would be interested to hear about any technologies that we haven't mentioned in the dossier, including, you know, the performance of these systems to remediate sort of firewaters and that sort of thing. So is anyone able to add anything on that?
I believe it was Appendix 3 that contains this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks, Bastian. So it was techniques like ion exchange resins, wasn't it, and activated carbon to a certain extent, although there are some concerns around the effectiveness of that, weren't they? So yeah, there's a whole range of technologies which may be useful to treat PFAS contaminated materials.
One of the options is also propose cement kilns, also like one of the option for the as supplementary to the incineration, if there is limited capacity for incinerating companies.
Okay, thanks, Piotr. And indeed, if that's any issues around that as an appropriate disposal, let us know in the consultation. But yeah, thanks. Okay, moving on to the next one. I think this is Greta. The question is, are remediation costs of PFAS polluted soil and polluted groundwater considered in the cost benefit analysis included in the Annex 15 report?
Yes, very interesting question. Thanks. So as of now, the restriction report does not quantify the benefits of reduced emissions. But the benefits were taken into account qualitatively, and the dossier submitter is actually looking for more information also related to this question, because potentially significant benefits in terms of reduced remediation costs from this phase out are expected, and especially also related to the removal of PFAS from drinking water. The dossier submitter is definitely interested in information and more information on these treatment costs. So if you have a look at the consultation note, question 6, there's actually one specific question to which perhaps anyone who has further information on this topic would be certainly very welcome to respond and submit more information about the costs of treating drinking water, or also, yeah, I think this would probably also apply to groundwater to extend the information base so that these benefits of the PFAS restriction can be better taken into account by the committees. Thanks.
Thanks, Greta. Okay, so the next question that we have at the moment is about this term PFAS free. And the question is, do you have a recommendation to evaluate what is considered as PFAS free? If the concentration of PFAS is below the threshold in the restriction, it's not necessarily PFAS free, but it would be outside of the scope of the proposed restriction. However, this slogan is being used for marketing purposes, and should there be a clearer definition of what is meant by this term PFAS is free? I think it's probably, maybe I'll take this one, I think it's a little bit outside of the scope of our discussions today. I think perhaps what we would be most interested in is whether or not a foam would be compliant with the conditions of the restriction or not. And perhaps therefore the term PFAS free is not a particularly useful term when we're looking at regulation in REACH restriction. Perhaps terminology like REACH compliant or something like this might be actually more meaningful when it comes to sort of marketing type phrases. So I don't think we'll go into that any more than now, but of course we're mainly focused on compliance with the restriction and not terms used for marketing, for example. Okay, maybe we can move on to the next question. This one is about cleaning equipment, so maybe this is Piotr, perhaps Bastian can jump in as well on this, perhaps. The question is, when cleaning installation equipment, we are always asked how we analyse the remaining fluorine on the surface of components like tubes and valves. Will there be a definition on how to collect appropriate samples from a system? This could be procedure driven from technical cleanliness. So who would like to answer that first? You're muted, Piotr.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's, we cannot advise here, I think, on the level of the restriction proposal how to do the sampling, because the installations are so different and so different constructions, and then we cannot really advise how to take the samples. And this you can, of course, discuss with the local enforcement authority who will check will enforce this. The important issue is that when you will refill the installation with the new foam, which is not where there's no added PFAS to that one, that the foams which you will use in the future contains below 1 ppm of the PFAS. And of course, is the question, how big is the installation, how big the surface area of the pipes inside, all the waves and everything, and how the PFAS deposited there will migrate to the foams. But I don't think that we can regulate anything on the level of the restriction proposal on such technical details. Thank you. Yes, one more thing, that in Appendix 1 we have some list of the cleaning procedures or proposals. So maybe you can refer to that one and check if that will apply to you, and you will get some information from there. And if not, if you have any, of course, as we repeat several times today, if you have any additional information on this topic, you are welcome to send it to via consultation, and we will be happy to add this to the appendix relevant section. Thank you.
Did you want to jump in on that, Bastian? No. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. Just from my reflections as well, just to recognise that this cleaning and decontamination of systems is not a unique problem just for this proposed restriction, because it was also in the past as well when other PFASs were phased out. So I'm sure there's quite a lot of experience in the industry about how to test for legacy PFASs in decontaminated systems and the best way about going about that. So if there are lessons that can be learnt and that information is not in our documentation, then please send it in the consultation. Okay, moving on to the next question. This is about releases to the environment. So Piotr, I think this is for you. The question is, ECHA assumes that the entire 18,000 tonnes of PFAS containing firefighting foams will end up in the environment as a result of its presence. And then a few slides later, there's mention of this 470 tonnes of PFAS per year in the EU. Maybe you could explain what the difference is between these values.
Yes, thank you. Yes, the first tonnage is tonnage of the PFAS containing firefighting foams. So we are talking about ready for use concentrates, which contains only a few percent of the PFAS as such. Depends on the type of foam, this concentration vary. While the 470 tons is pure PFAS. So we are talking about some of the tonnage of all those substances which are covered under PFAS term. So the difference is tonnage of the whole foams placed on the market and tonnage of the PFAS which are contained in those foams. That is the difference between those two numbers. Thank you.
Thanks, Piotr. Yeah, so these firefighting foams aren't 100% PFASs. There's lots of other constituents as well, including water, I presume. And this leads us on to the next question that might be again for you, Piotr, to answer, or others. There's a question here. I think I understand what it's about, and it's saying, what about the PFAS content of the water that's added during pre-mix fluorine-free extinguishers? And I think the point here is perhaps the water itself. Is there any potential that could include PFASs above the concentration limit? So when you're pre-mixing your application, you actually put it over the limit because of the content of PFASs in the water. I don't know if there's any reflections on this. It might be that we need to just get information on this in the consultation if this could actually happen in practice. But what does anyone think about that?
I would agree, Peter, with what you said, but I don't think that in the water the concentration will be so high that they can impact situation when we have that installation pre-filled before in 2.5% of PFAS and then clean up. I don't think that will have impact, but we do not have information on this. So please submit information if you have any information about this possible impact. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Piotr. Okay, maybe we can move on. I think this is a question for Greta, actually, because it talks about proportionality, and this is this terminology that is used to compare the costs and benefits of different regulation. And the question is, can the proportionality of the 1,000 ppb, this 1 ppm limit that we've applied, be explained? How can this be verified? Says no details are provided in the analysis, and then it talks about analytical methods. So I think there's two parts of this question. Perhaps the first part, Greta, is how was that limit value established? We can perhaps mention that. And then the second part of the question, which is I think for Piotr, is how would actually this be analysed? We covered this in one of the pre-submitted questions, but maybe we can go over that again if this question is still coming in. So Greta, over to you first about proportionality.
Yeah, so I mean one important element in the derivation of this value was that the dossier submitter has calculated the costs of the restriction for several concentration limits, or for several values, and it seemed that the limit finally chosen was in terms of the costs that are related to achieving this limit. It was still in a more manageable area, and of course this is something that has to be ascertained by comparing. So it's difficult to say how much what amount of costs is okay and what not. But here it seems that in terms of achieving a reduction in the environment and while having a look at the costs, that this value came out the most favorable, while there are also stricter options, of course, but then it was analyzed that the added reduction in that sense of PFAS would have led to substantially higher costs of implementing the restriction. So in that sense, even stricter values had been analyzed, but in terms of cost effectiveness, were finally not considered anymore. And maybe the rest of the question, I think, is then for Piotr.
Thanks, Greta. Thanks very much. So again, it's this compromise between risk reduction and the costs of the overall measure that's been tried to be taken into account by the dossier submitter. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Piotr, I think the question here is maybe not just about the methods, but in terms of how frequently and in what matrices this testing would have to be done for trying to guarantee compliance.
I think it's in that way, it's the question of the cleaning after the changing of the form in the system from the dose based on PFAS to those which are not have not PFAS added, and then you have to analyze this after the cleaning of the system, and then probably you have to do it once or twice when you start to use or fill the after you fill installation with the new form. But then afterwards, it's I think difficult to say if you have first 2 or 3 measurements below the threshold limits, and you know exactly the concentration of PFAS in the form are you refilling the installation. I don't see the really big problem, except maybe migration from the surface of the system from inside to the foam. But I don't think that we can advise here on this high level, not knowing the structure of the installation, size of the installation, concentrations before and after, before in PFAS in your system, how frequently you should do this testing to ensure that you comply with the requirements of the restriction. Thanks.
Thanks, Piotr. I think maybe the take home there is, as a user of firefighting foams, if you've previously had PFASs in your system and you've taken them out and cleaned, and now you're using alternatives, you need to be sure that should that foam be needed to be used tomorrow, that it would be below the limit. So if there's any potential for increase in PFAS over time through leaching, then that should be part of your enforcement and compliance sorts of activities. I'm a bit mindful now that we're very fast approaching the end of the session. We're certainly not going to get through all of the questions that we've received, but we will answer them in writing, of course. I think we've got time really for perhaps one more question. And I'll take this one myself, actually. The question is about timing. And perhaps from my presentation, there was maybe a bit of unclarity, and it's about the duration of the 6-month consultation, and it's about how this 6-month period corresponds to the whole duration of the opinion making period. So I think I can clarify that the consultation indeed is open now. It's a 6-month consultation, so it will finish in September. But the opinion making in both committees will carry on beyond that. In the RAC, the opinion making will carry on till December, all things well, and there's no delays. And in SAIAC, it will continue until March 2023. So the reason that consultation finishes before the opinion making is to ensure that all of the comments can be taken into account in the opinions. But also just to add perhaps that the SAIAC draft opinion, which should be available in December this year, also has its own consultation. So this is a 60-day consultation. So there's another opportunity to provide input on the SAIAC opinion once that's available and open for consultation comments. Okay, so I'm very sorry for anybody that's submitted a question that we weren't able to get to today. I'm afraid we are completely out of time, but please check back on the webinar pages for the Q&A. We will get to your questions and answer all of them. I think as a take-home message ought to be that if in doubt, please submit your information in the consultation. Please justify anything, please provide supporting information, and we can guarantee that all of these comments will be looked at by the dossier submitted team, but also by the RAC and SAIAC rapporteurs as they are developing their opinions. Please try and submit them as early in the process as possible. This will help, again, to get through the large number of comments that we're bound to achieve. But also, if you know that you are will submit something later in the consultation, it is possible to submit earlier and say, we will submit this information later. We're collecting information from memberships, for example, or we're doing some studies. If we know that this activity is going on, we can plan in the fact that it will come later in the proposal as well. So you're very welcome to make as many comments as you like, multiple comments, and certainly that's been very effective in the past when large stakeholder groups are phasing in their contribution to the consultation. So I think that brings us to the end of today's session. I'd like to thank very much the panelists for their time answering the questions. I'd like to thank anyone that submitted questions. It's been very interesting for us to do this. I'd like to thank the people in ECHA that were helping with the behind the scenes with the AV parts of things. Hopefully it's gone very smoothly for everybody. And thank you, last of all, anybody that's watching. I hope it's been useful. And we very much look forward to receiving your comments in the consultation. So again, thank you very much, and goodbye from Helsinki.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.